Thank you so much, Dr. Ben Caldecott, for joining us today here in Singapore and with us in Terrascope. So today we have Dr. Caldecott. We will learn a little bit about Ben's career trajectory and professional context. We're going to mainly be talking about transition plans, so the who, the what, the how, based on this latest milestone where we'll hear about a new disclosure framework is out. And of course, being Terrascope and focused on data, we'll talk about the data element underpinning the transition planning work and disclosure. So kicking off with a bit about you, you wear a couple different hats, just to name the main ones. So you're co-head of the Transition Plan Taskforce of the UK, a member of the UK Climate Change Committee, and you also sit on the Technical Council of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is the decision-making body of SBTi. And then I think co-founder of Oxford University's Smith School of Enterprise and Environment, and then one closer to home, which is the DBS Development Bank of Singapore's Sustainability Committee. So my first question is, how many hours do you have in your day? Because the rest of us have 24, and this sounds like an incredible portfolio. I'd love to know, what's the common thread through all of those?
Well, the same number of hours, and there absolutely is a common thread, which makes it all very synergistic. And I think one of the really fun things is spending time with different groups working on similar issues in different bits of the world. So you can see what governments in Europe are thinking. You can see what a pension fund in North America is doing. You can see what a big bank in ASEAN is thinking, and obviously that creates an opportunity to share knowledge and share experiences and provide that connectivity between different groups. So I think there's a bit of that I find fascinating, that's very interesting and makes it very easy. But the reason, it's great to be back in Singapore. I try to here maybe twice a year, and I'm here partly this week for a DBS Board Sustainability Committee meeting. Also, there's an organisation I helped to set up called the Global Research Alliance for Sustainable Finance and Investment, which is an alliance of research universities, and SMU is a member, and we have a big annual conference, big academic conference. So the academic community working on sustainable finance will rock up at a university, and next year it's Singapore. So myself and a couple of other people who are involved in setting up are speaking to SMU and getting to know that team. And then I'm also there's the Wealth Management Institute in Singapore, which spends a lot of time working with family offices, ultra high net worths, on sustainable investing type topics. I'm a visiting professor there, and that's another reason for being here.
What's been a pivotal experience or kind of moment that has shaped your entry into the climate and sustainability finance space?
I think in any career, there are going to be many critical moments. So is the question, was there a critical moment that got me into it, or was there a particular critical moment so far that I think is interesting?
Well, I guess what got you into it first, and then maybe a moment that's kind of pivoted you or shaped that journey that you've gone on.
So I sort of got into this as a policy wonk, really. So I was doing lots of policy work. A lot of the policy questions I was working on in think tanks, research institutes, were really about how you get capital into solutions to big environmental challenges like climate change. This is a hugely capital-intensive thing that we need to do. We need to mobilize tens of trillions of dollars very, very quickly into infrastructure, into new systems, and so on. And that obviously means you need to know how finance works, because it's the providers of capital, the organizers of capital, the owners of capital that need to be convinced. And so for me, it was I'd kind of decided that was the thing that I wanted to spend more time on. And then I had the opportunity to join a asset management and advisory firm as head of policy and research, working on exactly these topics. I think as sort of a moment that kind of changed my direction of travel has been, we were talking about COPs and the UNFCCC process before the cameras went live, and my first COP was Copenhagen. And
it was a rough one.
That was a rough one, and but it was also in so many ways, terribly misguided. I mean, the whole thing. So when we could talk more about top down versus bottom up and the challenges of the top down model that Copenhagen kind of embodied, and that's one of the reasons why it failed. But it just seemed to me in the run up to it an asset that everyone, the nickname for it was Copenhagen. no one was talking about the challenges of dealing with the losers, dealing with the stranded assets. So I was getting very frustrated that everyone was sort of talking about everyone's going to be a winner, the transition, no one's going to lose. And actually, if we don't confront the stranded assets, the implications for communities, for workers, for financial institutions, for governments, then you're much less likely to have a resilient transition. So I suppose since from Copenhagen, I really kind of spent a lot of time then working on developing this idea of stranded assets, working on that for quite a long time.
Well, it definitely resonates with the transition planning concept, which is kind of, I think a philosophy of it is working with high emitters and figuring out what that transition looks like. So how has that kind of stranded asset focus or the idea of having a more just transition shaped the transition planning work that you've been doing recently?
Well, I mean, I think the concern about stranded assets has shaped a huge amount of regulatory work and indeed all sorts of other things too. But I mean, the reason that central banks, for example, started to take this seriously was the risk of stranded assets and the implications for the solvency of financial institutions and the implications for financial stability. In terms of transition plans and why every actor should have one, not just high emitters, it's partly about avoiding stranded assets, navigating this, navigating yourself, your organization into a successful position in what's going to be a very turbulent transition. So thinking about how you can navigate that transition in a systematic way is part of it, part of what transition plans are about, absolutely.
So businesses are kind of everyday making decisions that result in good or bad outcomes. How are you thinking about what is a climate-induced stranded asset? Are you already seeing those kind of cropping up, or is this more you see the writing on the wall and it's about long-term planning?
So, yeah, I mean, two quite different questions. I mean, I think so. There are loads of examples of climate-related factors having an impact on the valuations of companies and stranding assets in all sorts of different sectors of the global economy. Now, take the power sector, and you've had lots of different fossil fuel assets becoming stranded, partly because of the very rapid reduction in costs that you're seeing in renewables over the last 20 years, particularly over the last 10 or so. So, or if you look at the automobile industry and electric vehicles, and now none of those changes are the direct result of there's a carbon budget and that's the driver. There are all sorts of reasons why electric vehicles are desirable from a societal perspective, and all sorts of reasons why consumers prefer them to ICEs, and so I think it's simplistic to just sort of go, well, there's a carbon budget, there's a net zero commitment, that will change everything. It is one critical societal objective, but underpinning that, there are all these other dynamics going on, whether that's energy security or concerns about air quality or the fact that these alternatives are better or more fashionable or more fun or whatever, that are driving the disruption that we're seeing across the global economy.
So let's dig into transition plans a little bit and unpack that. So the purpose of transition plans, what would you say is that a pretty common purpose? Do you see very different reasons why companies, are they just doing it because they have to, or financial institutions?
So transition plans are a new thing. Why they're important, and the genesis of the work that I've been doing with colleagues on transition plans comes from a place of, look, you've got all these net zero commitments and climate commitments. They don't have to be net zero commitments, but climate commitments from organizations around the world. I was quite involved in COP26 in Glasgow, and we had done a very good job, particularly in organizations like Race to Zero had just done a fantastic job of getting hundreds, thousands of commitments ahead of Glasgow. But that sort of begs the question, well, are these things going to be implemented? Are these promises going to be kept? And if you look back at some of these previous moments, there'll be promises left, right, and centre, but very little delivery. So there's a sense of, look, we need to have a credible framework for these commitments. And that's kind of what transition plans, that's a key use case of transition plans. It's making sure that if you've got a commitment, you've got a target, that you can show how you're going to deliver that ambition in the short, medium, and long term, and how you're going to be accountable for delivering that strategy over the long term as well. So the other reason for the work that we've been doing is that there's some regulatory requirements that have been introduced in the UK, specifically requirements to disclose transition plans on a comply-explain basis. That's already the case. There'll be mandatory transition plan disclosure requirements being introduced. There are consultations that are being initiated now. So that will come into force for accounting periods after January 2025. And that's great. But what is a good transition plan? And how do you assess these transition plans? So that's why we've developed a disclosure framework that sets out what a good transition plan should look like across different sectors, wherever you are in the world. And then on top of that, there is some sector-specific guidance that's being consulted on at the moment, and other materials to help preparers and users of transition plans. And simultaneously, the process that I've been co-leading has involved a lot of different regulatory agencies around the world. So it's definitely not just a UK thing, although it's started by the UK. And the Monetary Authority of Singapore has been an observer to that process. Other regulators in Asia also have shown significant interest, have been in dialogue with us. Japan, for example, Australia as well.
And so in 2025, companies that have to disclose will have to use this disclosure framework, or is it just kind of a best practice guide?
So it's a best practice guide, but the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK that's responsible for these rules for listed companies has said that it will consult on the disclosure framework and the guidance being kind of part of that preparers will have to have regard to those things when they're preparing their disclosures.
And so when you're assessing the transition plan and credibility, what are the green flags that you're looking for as you go through a transition plan?
Well, hopefully there are going to be lots of people assessing the quality of these transition plans, and I think there's an interesting question for people involved in the kind of the data value chain and how you provide data and analytics to do that. But you've got to start with levels of ambition. So what is the level of ambition? Is it consistent with the aims of the Paris Agreement? Is it consistent with the NDC of the jurisdictions in which these companies, these financial institutions have exposures to? Is it clear how that level of ambition is changing over time? And then that needs to be backed up with some really clear, tangible actions. What are the CapEx decisions that are going to be taken? And then, for example, in terms of accountability, that needs to be clear. You need to be really clear about who's making these decisions, who's responsible for these decisions, but also how you're going to do things to support your organization to embed this properly. So, for example, organizational culture is really important. How are you trying to create the right organizational culture? What are the incentives that you have? Remuneration policy, for example, of organizations to align with targets. So the disclosure framework has got a variety of different elements to it. You can find this on the Transition Plan Taskforce website. But the key, one of the key things to say about this disclosure framework, and the big conceptual leap that makes it quite different allows it to build off what's gone before, particularly the TCFD, that it's not just about the entity's decarbonisation. So it's not just about a company's or a financial institution's decarbonisation. And that's partly, I'll say more about why that's important, but it's also about, in addition to the entity's decarbonisation, it's also about how that entity is contributing to wider societal decarbonisation. And that's key. So you're a company or you're a financial institution, what are you actually doing to support this wider transformation that's needed? And actually, if you just focus on your own decarbonisation, that can create all sorts of issues, particularly as an example, if you're a bank or a financial institution, and you say, well, I'm going to achieve net zero in my investment portfolio, my loan book by a certain date, what are you going to do? Well, you might divest from a bunch of companies, and those companies might be polluting today, but we need them to be really sustainable tomorrow, and they need capital to transition. So it doesn't really serve anyone's interests in sort of achieving these headline targets, but actually just passing the buck on to somebody else, which is what we have started to see in bits of the financial services sector.
Yeah, a bit of reactionary divestment measures. And so the transition plan, so that's kind of like the long-term, I guess, but you were going to talk about the why, the purpose of, or why it's so important.
Well, if you want me to talk about those things, so there are a bunch of different use cases. And one of the use cases that's driven a lot of this is for listed companies, so part of public disclosures that companies make. So that's an important use case. And the idea is that if these big institutions, big companies, that could include financial companies, disclosing this information to the markets, then investors in those companies can make better decisions and allocate capital accordingly. But it isn't just about public markets. There are also obviously private markets. But there are also use cases that we're just starting to explore. So it could be procurement. Okay, you want a big contract with the government, you better have a transition plan. You want to access public finance. You want to tap up an export credit agency or a development bank for some cheap finance. Where's your transition plan? Or you're operating in a regulated sector. You're a water company, for example. Well, maybe you should have a transition plan. And then there are other use cases too, like stewardship and engagement. Big investors using this to empower their engagements and their engagement strategies with investee companies. There are things called sustainability-linked loans and sustainability-linked bonds. So these are forms of transition finance. You can imagine these instruments being linked to credible transition plans. And in fact, you can't have people talk a lot about transition finance. You can't really have you can't have good, effective transition finance without credible transition plans. So these things sort of go hand in hand.
And how does that differ for finance versus the real economy companies? So clearly there's, decarbonization is expensive. We try to find the ones that are less expensive or business aligned. But the finance, it sees that as an opportunity, right? It's an investment opportunity, a lending opportunity. For real economy companies, that feels more of a kind of bottom line cost. So how does the kind of guidance for transition planning in real economy differ in the disclosure framework? And what are some of the arguments you look at when you're thinking about cost versus opportunity?
So, I mean, you've got the challenge as a financial institution. You're providing capital to the real economy. You're providing financial services to the real economy. So you're kind of somewhat constrained based on what's actually out there in the real economy and how the real economy is changing. But you can, depending on the asset class and the context, you can start to influence the direction of travel, which speaks to this point around thinking about this wider societal contribution. As a bank in a particular jurisdiction, how can you support actors in that jurisdiction to change? And it might be that one of the things you can do is you can talk to the government and you go, look, if you want us to provide capital, these are the things that need to happen. Or you can, and not necessarily or, and you can design products and services to help SMEs transition, for example. So I think you've got to kind of. That's the main distinction. In a sense, it's a bit easier almost for a real economy company to think about this because you're not one step removed, if you see what I mean. But in terms of costs, elaborate a bit on your point about costs and opportunities or benefits.
Yeah, from thinking about the cost of the transition, right? It's so you've got your existing assets, and if you're from the finance institution, there's a lot of kind of that net zero transition. You can be I guess you can shift easier. So we see both the easier and the more challenging aspects from real economy versus finance. If you're the real economy company, for example, the clients that we work with. The decarbonization, there may be some low-hanging fruit, but where is that capital going to come from a business viability perspective, right? So,
but it's funny because your point about it's easier for a financial institution. Yes, it's easier if you define it as exiting the investments, which is not what I define a good transition plan to be. So, and it's part of the problem.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, obviously, companies in the real economy are going to have, they've got to navigate their own issues, and it's really difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, so transition plans, could be in fact probably the biggest opportunity for greenwashing ever. Right? I've got a transition plan.
Lend me XYZ dollars.
You need users of these things to be able to, they need BS detectors. They need to be able to see which plans are credible or not. And just because you've got a plan, if it's not a good plan, there's no reason why you should be able to raise capital. And not every company is going to be able to transition. So it's there is a bit of a risk that we're creating this myth that, everyone can transition. It's all going to be fine. No, it goes back to the stranded assets. Actually, in any sector, in any geography, not every company is going to have to transition. And so, although this does become a vehicle for providing capital and financial services to companies with credible transition plans, it also means that you've got finite capital as an institution. You will start to shift capital away, but it's not kind of. I feel like that's a sort of doing that effort and using transitional plans to determine that is much more effective for actually trying to achieve the change we want to see than just kind of going, I've got a portfolio decarbonisation target and I'm going to work back from that, and one other interesting thing in this space is thinking about the kind of the lumpiness of the transition from an emissions perspective in a portfolio. So you could, if you invest in a polluting company, but you believe they've got a credible transition plan, as an investor, your emissions are going to go up. But actually, that could be totally the right thing to do. So we also need to be, I think, as consumers, as clients, beneficiaries of these financial institutions in different ways, need to also be empowered to assess, what's really going on.
Yeah, well, I think in the GHG data underpinning piece, a lot more around rebaselining. And so when an acquisition or a divestment is made, actually that we go back to the base year and take that out or add it in. So it feels much more important, the direction of travel. How fast can that decarbonize? Although the intensity metrics are also relevant, and companies do get kind of compared on that in financial institutions as well. But just from an accounting perspective, going back and rebaselining does help to isolate some of those strategic questions and just see what does that curve look like. So on the note of GHG metrics and targets, and before I open up a little bit to questions from online and in person, so the Taskforce faced some challenges around availability and quality of data. And there was kind of this quote that it really needs, market participants will need to improve. So what were some of the limitations that you faced with data quality around the emissions in the Taskforce work on the disclosure framework?
So it's not us having a specific problem with data. It's users and preparers, right? So the wider market, and you guys are very close to this, you'll have a view of some of the issues, but it goes from everything to, estimation methodologies, how you're actually calculating the emissions if you aren't observing them, problems with that, through to, a lot of observational issues, and then relatedly, projections out as well. What are the assumptions you're using for different projections? But a lot of those data challenges will depend on the sector and the geography.
Okay. And so sector, geography, but I mean, it was really impressive to see the task force, how diverse and kind of cross-sector. So you have non-profit inclusion, you have academia, government, and corporates, and then trying to kind of reconcile that. I think especially rubber hits the road with Scope 3 supply chain data quality. So in the recommendations, Scope 3 is recommended, correct? It's like a kind of it's a green flag if Scope 3 emissions are included. Were there like supply chain discussions that you held around the value chain in particular?
So we've got over 100 different organisations, a variety of different working groups, including 7 sector-specific working groups. So we just initiated a consultation on 7 sectors and sector-specific guidance. So there's a food and ag, power generation, power utilities, metals and mining, oil and gas, and the real economy, and then banking, asset management, asset owners. So all of those groups will have had conversations about emissions reporting, data quality, and so on and so forth, as well as some cross-cutting issues in the disclosure framework and the non-sector specific guidance. So I think for people that are interested, have a look at our website, and you can have a look at the materials, and specifically for the consultation, for the sectors, it's still under consultation. So you've got until the end of December to provide some input. And if you're particularly interested in data issues, do have a look and input.
Okay, wonderful. So that's a good reminder to another month or so to input. And then what's the timeline for those sector-specific requirements?
So it's guidance, not requirements, but the guidance will come out in Q1, end of Q1.
Excellent. Busy work over the holidays. So are there any questions? Opening it up. Yeah. Anything online as well? Yeah.
Thanks for sharing. I have a question around the hypothetical case. Let's say a company that their business model is fundamentally unsustainable. Take for a fast fashion company, right? And how do you convince them that they need a transition plan? And probably the world doesn't need another fast fashion company, and they can, we can do very well without them. So in this case, so what can they do?
What can they do, or what can we do? I mean, I think what can we as society do for a company that is, not very sustainable? Well, we can do all sorts of things. We can stop that company operating if we want to. So I think a lot of this is bound together with political economy issues in all sorts of jurisdictions. Now, in this particular, I guess, paradigm that we have around disclosure and information, governments ought to go and investors ought to go, well, we want to see your transition plan and we want to assess whether it's credible or not. And it might be that it's not. And it might be there's some institutions that don't want to lend money to it or invest in it. But there might be some that do and are happy to. So there are inherent limitations in these sorts of disclosure-based approaches. But I do think that in contrast to disclosures about data, or the sort of where we spend a lot of time with disclosure, actually getting an entity to prepare to actually disclose a strategy and then be accountable for the strategy actually speaks to what disclosure is best at, which is holding actors to account. Whereas, so much of the data that's disclosed, is useless, even if it was correct and accurate. Often it's not accurate, which is why there's millions spent on assuring disclosed information. But it's backward looking, and there are all sorts of issues with so we could have a whole conversation about the quality of disclosure. But I think, one of the first steps is we need entities to think about what they're doing and then hold them to account. But obviously the TPT can't solve the bigger societal question that you're asking, which is obviously the key question.
What's a common misconception about sustainable finance that you notice is out there in the world, and that you're trying to kind of course correct on?
I'm going to rephrase your question slightly and say, what's a common misconception about ESG? Because that's a bit easier in the sense that, ESG is not about saving the world, essentially. So, ESG as a concept, which has become conflated with sustainable finance, which is why I'm kind of sidestepping the sustainable finance question slightly. People are kind of adding so many things to it. So it's about the Paris Agreement, it's about human rights, it's about blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's just about the integration of material ESG factors to make better risk-adjusted returns. It doesn't say anything about making the world a better place. I mean, incidentally, it might, although there's some big questions about whether it actually does. So I think there's some misconceptions there. Whereas I think sustainable finance more broadly is about risk, but it is about making change. and it is a broad concept, intentionally a broad concept. So, yeah.
Okay. Not saving the world, I think. Yeah. Any other questions? Open up.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Dr. Ben. You are one of the authors of the Oxford Principles for net zero aligned carbon offsetting. So I'll take it that you're a carbon offsets expert. So my question is on carbon offsets. In view of the situation in the markets, carbon offsets markets this year, what is your view on the trajectory of the markets, and what needs to change to regain market confidence in this market?
I used to work a lot in the carbon markets, and I think we have for too long, fetishized liquidity in this market and tradability. And the real, the key thing is we want projects that are doing good to be economic and then to be financeable. Now, to generate those cash flows for those projects to be economic, you could have a tradable instrument that you sell into a global liquid market. But constructing that is proving really very difficult. And we're kind of confusing ends with means. And we need to be much more focused on the ends and what we're trying to achieve. And so you can create bankable, investable projects in all sorts of things around the world without a carbon market. And we need to focus more on results-based contracts and results-based payments. And that those contracts should be standardized and bankable and investable. And if there is a tradable commodity at the end of it, then great. But that isn't the primary objective. Now, unfortunately, what's happened is that a lot of people who want to trade these things at various stages of the development of the carbon markets, have been very influential, and that's directed policy energy and collective energy, and that's an example of a suboptimal allocation of mental capacity and resource and all the rest of it, right? And unfortunately, there are lots of examples of that in this broad space of sustainable finance, climate finance, of which I'd say carbon markets is kind of part. So that really annoys me, and there's so many things like that. It's really frustrating.
Feels a bit similar to the focus on carbon capture and storage. When you look at price per ton of carbon impact, we're seeing a lot of kind of policy focus on the carbon capture and storage.
To no effect, it seems. Yeah. I mean, so I don't dispute the fact that you need CCS if you want to do lots of industrial carbon removals, which we need to achieve net zero. But let's have a conversation about how we deploy this technology in a way to support that objective, rather than keeping coal-fired power stations going or gas-fired power stations going.
And our transition plan's a vehicle to kind of put these solutions in context and think about what the broader landscape of a credible decarbonization should look like.
I mean, I hope so. Yeah. But we can create a framework. We can create some guidance. If people are not using this stuff appropriately, and don't know how to use it, or asking the wrong questions, there's so much of this will depend on building up capabilities within users and preparers, but particularly users, so they can analyze and then differentiate between different transition plans.
Okay, I want to come back to the users question, but there's a online. We've got it online.
Yeah, question from Asta. What are some examples of metrics to hold companies accountable for their transition plan strategy? How are these metrics measured?
So they should have a look at the disclosure framework and the guidance. And there are some suggestions, particularly in the sector-specific guidance, for different metrics. But as I say, those things are open for consultation. So as a process, we'll be open to some suggestions and thoughts about that.
So you mentioned users and preparers. Can you unpack that a little bit for us? Who are the key users?
So preparers are entities that are preparing transition plans.
So your in-house sustainability teams, maybe consultants.
Yeah, sorry. When I was talking about that, I just meant like companies or financial institutions or local government or central government or public financial institutions or
All the
whatever,
actors.
whatever the actors are. But that's a super interesting question. Who within these organisations is actually doing this work? And one of the key things in all the recommendations that are out there about transition plans is this needs to be a core part of corporate strategy. But with all of this stuff, if it's all outsourced or it's done in some function that isn't relevant, isn't seen to be relevant to corporate strategy, then it's not going to be part of corporate strategy, even if they claim it is part of corporate strategy. So I think it's a really good question about who's preparing it within an organisation, and then who's accountable to it.
Mm-hmm. And similarly, on the user side, are the right according to kind of where you see change happening, are the right people using it within the?
Well, it's so early. So early. So again, when I was thinking about users, I was thinking more providers of capital, providers of financial services, but also regulators, governments as well. Again, I think you've having a conversation with somebody yesterday about this, that there's a sort of an assumption, say in the asset management industry, for example, that you want the users to be the portfolio managers, not the sustainability people. Crudely, that's one view that people have. I think you probably want it to be both groups. Mm-hmm. You want empowered sustainability professionals in the asset management industry who know how to use this stuff. Then you want to make sure that portfolio managers see how this stuff is useful for understanding, risk and reward, and see how it's useful for analysing the performance of investments over time. Mm-hmm. So that kind of requires both those groups, to the extent they might be separate, to both use these things and understand how they are useful, but probably in slightly different ways.
I'd like to talk a little about the carrots and the sticks approach. So you've been involved in some high-profile litigation cases around the world, correct? Testifying. And we saw, at least according to the Financial Times, the GFANZ, the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero companies, kind of worried about litigation risks. So what are some of the sticks that you see playing out? Like, is litigation, was that considered in transition planning? Do you see that as a risk of either doing plans or not doing plans?
So we have published some legal advice, or maybe advice is probably not the legal term. I'm sure there's all sorts of disclaimers about this not being advice. Okay. Some sort of comparative analysis or assessment or something from a bunch of law firms about transition plans and why there are no legal impediments to doing these things, and why it's probably in your best interest as a corporation to do them as a way of actually managing litigation risk in the future. And I think one of the big risks will be for corporates not preparing transition plans when it was pretty clear that was what they should be doing, and then getting sued for not doing so. So that, I think people will be testing those sort of legal strategies. But just to be clear, I haven't been involved in designing legal strategies. I've just been an expert witness a couple of times, but I did help set up an NGO that does work in Singapore as well as in other Commonwealth common law jurisdictions called the Commonwealth Climate and Law Initiative, CCLI, that is essentially builds capacity and helps fiduciaries and company directors to understand and minimize their exposure to these litigation related and legal, not just litigation, other forms of legal risk as well.
Mm-hmm. And then the carrot question is, or should transition finance be more affordable, better terms? Is that something we can even define? Yeah.
I think that is a key feature of transition finance, mm-hmm. for it to be effective. That if you are doing things that reduce your impact and reduce your risk, then yes, if you should be benefiting from a lower cost of capital. And the kind of the upside for financial institutions is better risk-adjusted returns. These things are low risk, but also I think for big institutions, particularly in the banking space, is this is a capex intensive transition, as discussed at the very beginning. So it's sort of so even if you're providing a lower cost of capital because these things are less risky, you're financing more stuff. That's going to be a good thing for you as a banking institution.
And are you seeing that? Do the numbers back it up? It doesn't feel like it in like the kind of analysis we've seen coming out.
No, it doesn't back it up at all. I mean, look, you've got...
Are we 3 to 5 years out or 2 years out?
But I mean, the sustainability linked kind of those instruments are potentially hugely powerful, but there's a lot of greenwashing in that market.
We're getting there, right? And having a good kind of commonly accepted standard of transition is one step in that direction. Absolutely. There's this quote: "Change before you have to," and it comes from Jack Welch, who's CEO of General Electric for a long time, and I think everyone agrees that we need to change, and that we are taking steps to change. But at the same time, change is incredibly difficult, whether you're a government or even academia, I'm assuming. Definitely a company with global supply chains. And so what is one actionable piece of advice that you would have as a kind of next step for leaders, in particular in the real economy, on this kind of transition plan change journey?
Well, very simply is to develop a transition plan and begin that process. If you haven't done that already, refine it, iterate it, improve it, back it up, back your ambitions up with tangible, specific actions, short, medium, long term, and accountability mechanisms that will persist, be helpful, drive outcomes even after you as a senior executive depart the organization, right? Because we've got to create these systems, these cultures, these mechanisms that can exert influence in different organizational contexts over decades. So, but it starts, I think, with thinking about this systematically, and I think the best way of doing that is actually this process of transition planning.
Wonderful. And you wear many hats, so is there anything we didn't cover from other hats that you wear, or very topical, that you'd like to touch on?
Super interesting conversation. There's always loads of stuff going on. So maybe next time in Singapore we could continue the conversation.
Sounds great. Love to.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Ben.
Thanks, Lia.
Appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.